Welcome to our podcast, listeners. Today, we're going to be talking about a tough subject, but a very important one. Teenagers today are facing unprecedented levels of stress and mental health challenges. One of the most concerning issues is the rise in suicide ideation among the age groups. It is crucial for parents and caregivers to be able to recognize the signs of suicide ideation in teens and know how to respond effectively. In this podcast, we will delve into the precursors of suicide ideation in teenagers, providing valuable information and resources for parents who may be concerned about their child's mental health. Please remember that this podcast is not a replacement for therapy. Please always seek a mental health professional for your situation. My name is Tiffany Herlin, a licensed clinical social worker, and today I'll be interviewing Allison Jenkins, an LCSW, and Reggie Wilson, also an LCSW, from OASIS Ascent, a short-term residential program that provides stabilization and a comprehensive evaluation for teenagers 12 to 17 who may qualify for insurance coverage. You guys, I'm so excited to have you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, we're excited as well.
Yeah, and we've talked before this, and I just think you guys have a wealth of knowledge to share with our listeners. So let's start with a little bit about yourself and what your role is at OASIS. So Allison, go first.
Thanks, Tiffany. My name's Allison. I am the clinical director at OASIS Ascent. We opened our doors on September 29th, 2021. So we're 3 years strong and have helped a lot of kids and families. So I'm their clinical director. I also have a background. I started out when I was a therapist. I started out in a residential treatment center. I've done all levels of care. I worked in outpatient therapy, all working with adolescents and younger children as well. I worked in outpatient therapy. I've worked in residential. I worked at Huntsman Mental Health Institute, previously known as UNI, the University of Utah Neuropsychiatric Institute. I worked there for 4 years in crisis and stabilization. I've also worked in an emergency room at Primary Children's Hospital for 5 years, where I've seen completed suicides, and I've also seen kids that come in with suicidal ideation and plans, helping them, safety plan, helping them and the families understand in the ER what's the best direction of going to inpatient psych unit is appropriate. And then I worked in residential for 4 years at youth care, where I've learned a ton, and then came to OASIS. So yeah, that's my experience.
You have quite a breadth of experience, and so again, excited to hear your thoughts on this topic.
Thank you.
Because it sounds like you've been from like the beginning to the crisis to the end. I mean, you've seen all aspects of it.
Every level of care I've worked in.
Yeah. Thank you. Reggie, go ahead.
Well, good. Tiffany, thank you for having both of us. So as you said, my name is Reggie Wilson, and I am a licensed clinical social worker. And like Allison, I have a vast variety and array of experience. I've worked at different levels of care in the mental health system, including residential, including outpatient, including day treatments, and inpatient units as well. And so been in the business over 2 decades. I have experience in seeing kids who are experiencing all sorts of suicidal ideation. I have seen also completed suicides, unfortunately. But I really enjoy talking about this topic because it needs to be talked about.
Yeah.
And I think too many of us are afraid to talk about it because we're afraid of what the outcome might be. But I think prevention is the best approach. I am clinical director at OASIS here in Provo. And
because you guys have 2 different campuses. Yeah. Let's clarify that for our listeners.
Yeah, Allison works at our Mill Creek office, and she works with the females.
Which is North Salt Lake.
North Salt Lake.
For those that are from Utah. Sorry, not North.
No, like it's East Salt Lake.
But that's right.
Yeah,
I apologize.
East Salt Lake. No, that's okay.
It's north from here.
Oh, north from here.
In my mind.
Yeah. Right.
We'll have listeners from all over, so I'm just trying to give them some.
So Allison has been at OASIS for, like she said, about 3 years, working with the females, and I've been at OASIS in Provo working with the males, age groups 12 to 17.
Okay.
And we see a variety of different issues with our students. And I'm in charge of all the clinical operations there, make sure that they are therapeutically sound, manage 4 very competent therapists, and I really enjoy it.
So in this episode, we're going to be talking about recognizing the signs, the symptoms of suicidal ideation teens. So to help our parents know the difference between, is my teen really being serious about this, or are they just having an off day? And can we just start, you and I had a conversation off air where we were like, this is just a hard topic. You mentioned you enjoy talking about this, which, okay, our listeners are like, really? You enjoy it? Like, that sounds a little strange, but that being said, it needs to be talked about.
Absolutely. Yeah. I do think that it does definitely need to be talked about, because it's such a it's so looked down upon as a society, and it's a taboo thing. And I think what we have to understand is that there's a healthy way to talk about this, and there's a healthy way of normalizing this, because there's people sometimes that think that this, for some reason, is a selfish thing. It's we don't think about the ramifications of it. Are we really suicidal? Are we trying to get attention? Are we there's so many different ways that people look at this, and what I hope that this segment does is it helps us normalize the fact that some people do feel like this, and then help them to validate those feelings, and help to have them have a safe place to talk about it. If we don't do that, then what we do is we encourage them to internalize it, and then that's when we see bigger problems.
Right. Yeah, and it's a scary topic, right? As well, as a parent, if your child comes to you and says they're suicidal,
or hints at it, or
you hear about it from a teacher or from one of their, I've heard of,
or read a text that they wrote to a friend.
Yeah, or sometimes when their friends reach out to parents, it's a really scary topic. And I think, I hope this is informative to help parents understand that, like, as Reggie said, there is a healthy way to talk about it. And the completed suicides that I saw at Primary Children's, the saddest part was a lot of the parents were like, we had no idea he was struggling or she was struggling. We had no idea. Like, they were not in therapy. They were, just living their lives. And then all of a sudden, this happens and this tragedy happens, and
they miss the signs.
If this is helpful, if this podcast is helpful to have parents start understanding and recognizing some signs and when to get help and not to walk on eggshells around the topic, it could really save lives. Yeah.
Well, it's like shame is bred in secrecy, right? And this is a very shameful topic, especially depending on your beliefs around it, sometimes even religious beliefs around it. I mean, it just really, morals, it's just so complicated and gray. And, when we don't talk about it, it gets bigger and scarier. And sometimes when you name the scary monster in the room, it's not as scary. I just think about my daughter who doesn't want to go to bed at night because she's worried about monsters. But when I go in her room at night and I open the closets and make a joke and say, can we put the monster in like rollerblades going down the hill acting crazy? She starts laughing about it. It's like, oh, okay, it's not that scary, right? Like, so when you address it head on and talk about it, not saying it goes away instantly. I wish it was that simple as with,
But you shrink the monster, right?
Exactly.
And so if you think about anxiety, for example, the more you talk about it, the more you get out of those uncomfortable places. That anxiety isn't as tough. It doesn't have the big teeth.
Yeah.
Suicide's the same thing. So when we talk about it, then that's when we normalize it.
Right.
And so it makes it okay to talk about, and for the individual, it helps them to look at other ways to manage that. and it's not such a big scary monster.
And they realize they're not alone.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Not alone. They can connect with, others that have the same, issues and get the support they need if we normalize it, and if the parents start normalizing it as well.
Which is one of the protective precursors that we'll talk later about, is that connection piece is huge. Because when you're in your head and you feel alone, I'm going to be a little bit of a nerd, Harry Potter, right? Do you guys like Harry Potter?
Yeah, I read that to my kids all the time.
So our Harry Potter fans out there, you get to the 6th book and you just get so angry at Harry Potter because I'm going off on a tangent, but there's a reason. I promise. He gets so in his head and he thinks he's so alone and he has these demons and he's fighting off, these, the 5th and 6th book, he's fighting off these scary things in his head that he won't go talk to Dumbledore. But anyways, it's the same thing. Like when we stay in our heads, it gets bigger, it gets unmanageable. We're disconnected. We feel alone, isolated. That's when things get scary.
Yeah.
But when we reach out and we connect and we get the help that we need, I think some parents feel like, oh, if I talk to my kids about this, it's going to mean they're actually going to do it.
Correct.
And I'm going to make it worse. And it's like, no, actually, that seems counterintuitive. But actually, when you talk about it, it actually can lessen it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think when talking to parents about that particular subject, they're going to think, if I bring it up, now it's going to be in their head, and now it's stuck, and now it's something that they will always fall back on, right? And so we have to, when talking to parents, we have to normalize that fear for them, right? That I know this is what you think. What are some of the other reasons why you feel like you don't want to bring it up? And just validate that. And then we can come back around and say, here's why we want to talk about it. Because we want to help give our kids a platform to talk to us about it, so that we can use those things that they fear and help them to see that that they can come and talk to them, that they're not going to be punished or they're not going to be isolated, and the parents aren't going to shame them. And so that's one of the things that I think we have to do to help parents understand. First, validate their fears, and then tell them why it's important to talk about it.
Yeah, and Tiffany, when we were off air yesterday, I loved what you said, that it's a behavior, right? The suicide is a behavior. And when I'm working with kids, what I'm always looking at is what is the function, right? What are the emotions behind it? What's going on in their lives? What are the emotions that are building up? And so we're looking at the function of the suicidal behaviors. And then, when you understand the function, then you're validating what needs to be validated. Because we can't validate the fact you want to kill yourself, right? That's invalid. We can validate the emotions behind it, and we can validate what the struggles are, and we can validate and help them understand that, it's the emotions behind it and all of that. And then when we treat that, hopefully the suicidal ideation will start decreasing.
I love this. And you guys you're jumping ahead a little bit. But that's okay, because we are going to talk about, it's not as simple as, you're either suicidal or not. Like, there's so much more complexity that leads up to that, and it's not always the same for everybody. But let's back up just a minute, and I want to jump back to what you were saying, Reggie. It's interesting, as we've prepped for this topic with my team and even myself, and we were talking about, this has touched so many people's lives. Like, it's touched my life personally. I've had a family member who has attempted multiple times and eventually was successful. And it's not uncommon, it's more common. So I wanted to point out a few facts and research that I found.
Sure.
Before we jump to your topic, that's so important. These are just a few after doing my own research around this I thought was interesting. So suicide is one of the leading causes of death among adolescents. So parents, if you're listening and you're thinking, I'm going to plant this idea in their head, the problem is it's already there. It's already there. Yep. Not necessarily with every teenager, but it's being talked about with our teens and amongst their friends and on social media and on their text messages. Like, guaranteed they've either, brushed up against it with someone else or had thoughts of their own. It's just unfortunately what we're facing.
Right.
Mental health problems are risk factors, which we'll dive into, depression, anxiety, substance abuse. Sometimes parents divorcing can also lead up to any breakup in their home, stabilization, right?
Yep.
I thought this was interesting. Approximately 1 in 5, so that's 18.8% high school students reported seriously considering attempting suicide in 2019.
Wow.
This was before 2020.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
Which
Pandemic,
I am curious. I could not find the data yet for 2020, but I'm so curious to see what there is once it comes out.
Right.
Again, about 1 in 6 high school students made a suicide plan. 2019. And then 2019, 8.9% of high school students reported attempting at least once in the past year. That's high.
Yeah, that is really high. Yeah, I'm not surprised.
Yeah, I'm not surprised either. And that's why it's so important for us to have a conversation about this, right?
Not dance around the topic.
Right, because those statistics don't lie. And I agree with you. I would like to see the numbers for post pandemic.
I do have one thing that I found. It said suicide ideation and attempts and other related mental health concerns during the COVID-19 pandemic are still of concern.
Sure. Yeah.
So I'm assuming they probably increased. There's so much more. We could dive into that.
Yeah. Well, we all know that when COVID hit, the mental health needs just went through the roof, the amount of providers could not keep up with the need especially in the cities and in the inpatient hospitals. And that's why when we opened OASIS, I love the model because there's a lot of students that maybe don't meet criteria for an inpatient psych hospital because they're having ideation and, they're navigating that. And so then they can come to OASIS and not be in a hospital setting, but getting that treatment that they need.
Yeah, because you guys at OASIS kind of deal with those crises.
Yep.
But not quite because a lot of people are like, well, what do I do if they're having ideation, but they haven't attempted? Like, where's that in between? They don't need to go to the hospital just yet, but they're not safe.
Right.
So you guys are a great safe landing place for them.
Yes, 100%.
Let's talk about a couple of things before we dive further, but some vulnerable groups. We have LGBTQ youth. They're about 4 times more likely to consider suicide. Black students have the highest prevalence of suicide attempts among race ethnic groups, and sexual minority youth, and those who reported having sexual contact with the same or both sexes have higher rates of suicide ideation. I know there's more out there, but these are the groups that we're just seeing higher risk with that we need to be looking out for.
Sure.
Risk factors, I'm not going to go through too much of them, but obviously the biggest one is disconnect. Disconnect from meaningful relationships, history of family suicide, substance abuse. So when we talk about stuff that leads up to it, it's not a simple, oh, you're suicidal or not. It could be mood disorder. They talk about having access to lethal means. History of multiple adverse childhood experiences, chronic medical conditions, and ultimately, I thought this was the most interesting: hopelessness and helplessness.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
So, I am not surprised that these groups are some of the most vulnerable. When I look at all of it, I think there's 2 things that come to mind, and I think that increases their vulnerability, and that is identity and connection. And you kind of mentioned connection, and I think that our youth right now, our age groups, they're trying to figure out where they are, who they are, and where they belong. And if they don't have that identity or that connection to validate who they are, then of course some of those questions start to creep in. Some of the hopelessness, helplessness, maybe even, and not having someone to talk to who they feel get them, And so what happens as a result, right, is that, I'm not important. I have all these weird feelings going on, and so I can't connect with people. And then the ultimate decision is, well, I can't live with this. And so I think that
I'm better off not here.
And I'm better off not here.
I feel so alone. I'm better off. And I think, too, a big factor, too, is, adolescents, their brains are still developing and their impulse control, and we see...
Which is normal,
typical. And when you add depression and suicidal thoughts on there, that makes them very vulnerable, and especially substance abuse, to, making attempts when they're in distress, right? Their distress tolerance, they have limited tools to manage the distress. And then with their, poor impulse control and, access to lethal means, I mean, that's just the trifecta of a completion or an attempt, right?
That's the biggest one. You and I just completed, we as therapists, for our parents and listeners, we have to complete suicide trainings every 2 years and make sure we're up to speed on that. And I mean, that's like the biggest precursor, is that do they have access to a means?
That's one of the biggest questions that they ask. And along those lines, there's also ways that some of those evaluations, they ask some of those questions, and we, unfortunately, our kids have heard a lot of these questions, and they know how to navigate that. And so I think it's really critical that we as evaluators and even parents learn how to be creative in asking questions.
With the CSSRS and the tools.
Which we'll get to. So don't jump too far ahead with those. But we're going to help our parents understand how to ask without setting our kids up to tell us what we want to hear.
Sure.
Right? And to be honest.
Correct.
Yeah.
And that, and a big factor too is that takes a lot of trust. It takes a lot of trust in their clinicians. It takes, building that trust with their parents as well, because, if they're going to share that information and not know how it's going to land on their parents, that's another, reason they would be protective of that, right?
So you're saying they have to be connected to
They
their
have
parents?
to be, yes.
Again,
connect.
going back, we're just going to...
And feeling safe that they can come to their parents and say, hey, I'm having these feelings. And the parents have to be confident as well, of like, okay, then, all right, so you're having these feelings. How can I support you? Instead of, we need to run to the ER. Because a lot of times it doesn't need to be an ER visit.
But it goes back to us as parents, the adults, to normalize the pathways for our kids to come to us, because kids aren't just going to do that. They're just not. I mean, they may when they're really little, because they want you to take care of them. But by the time they hit adolescence, coming to an adult is kind of frowned upon, right? But if we have normalized that process the whole time, when they are adolescents, they don't have to work at it.
Yeah.
It's kind of a normal process. So parents need to understand that it starts when they're really young.
You got to put money in the bank when they're young.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because
100%.
when you start hitting those teenage years, they shut the door and they lock
Which
it
is
really
normal
tight.
teenage development.
And they
go to their friends.
They go to their friends.
That's just how it is.
Yep.
Yep.
And you're going to have to take money out because you're going to have to hold some stupid hard boundaries with them because they're going to push them. So you've got to put the effort in before so that they feel safe. I totally agree.
And especially parents that know there's a family history of suicide, and especially parents that know there's a genetic predisposition for depression and anxiety. And of course, we know not all depression can lead to suicidal thoughts, but if if you're predisposed to that and you know your children could be, then you've got to front load that. You've got to get ahead of it.
And who they're talking to peer wise.
Oh,
if they've got a peer group and they, no, I don't read everything. I've got a teenager and I don't read everything she texts me, but she does know that I have a system on her phone that gives me alerts. And if there's something that's alarming, it's going to pop up on my phone and let me know, and we're going to have a discussion about it. The cool thing is she's come to me before I've even gotten an alert and said, hey, this came up. I don't know how to handle this with a peer. It wasn't suicide, but it was something else. And it was like, you know, you want to be able to be connected with them. So when their peers start talking about scary things, because it's not if it's when. You know, if one of their peers is going to bring something hard up, because life is hard.
And just think, Tiffany, if you have that relationship with your daughter where it's healthy, it's normal, and you're giving good feedback, you're listening and you're validating, when her friend has an issue and she reaches out to your daughter she's got some ammunition to use, and she can help that teen, and she can encourage that teen to seek help if needed. So it really is about helping our children to come to you, but also in a way it's also encouraging them to also help their friends.
Oh, I love that. Because they're going to be the most powerful influence in each other's lives.
100%.
Almost more sometimes than parents at that stage.
Absolutely.
Which in our second episode, just so our parents listening can stay tuned, we're going to dive into toolkits for our parents. And I think it's important to point out here that, and something we'll talk more about coming up in the next episode, is that parents, you've got to be able to be grounded enough and taking care of your own emotional well-being. So when your teen does come to you, that it's not triggering and sets you off and has you spiraling, because then you're not going to be able to show up for them. So, but we'll talk more about how do you do that. So, going back, let's dive into what are some of the most common warning signs of suicide ideation in teens that our parents can look for?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's interesting, like as I've interviewed kids over the years, what that looks like. The younger kids, it's really interesting. I think ages like 5 to 10 or 11, they really don't understand suicide. And so what they just don't want to be here. Like life gets so tough for them. They don't have really a plan or intent, but life is just so hard.
They might be more impulsive.
They just don't want to be on this planet, right? And so
they're trying to get rid of the pressure.
Right. So their suicidal ideation is more, I just want to go to sleep and not wake up, right? And as we interview, you know, as I've interviewed older students, it starts looking more like changing in friend groups, a lot of isolating, hypersomnia, sleeping a lot, insomnia, not sleeping, self-harm, students that start self-harming and harming themselves on purpose, self-injurious behaviors, that can, be a good warning sign that they are, considering or thinking, or that's came up in their mind. And then social connections, right? It's interesting because the peer groups can be positive or there can be negative. And I think when we talk about connection and we talk about someone that's suicidal seeking connection, and they seek connection from someone else that's suicidal or someone else that's self-harming. And so that can be tricky as well because, they are, that's how they seek connection and not feel so alone. And it's not the best help. Like I've talked to parents where they're like, yes, my daughter is so depressed and all of her friends are so depressed and she can't, get out of this. They're all helping and rescuing each other. And so I think that's a big warning sign too of like who are, dropping out of sports to start gravitating to possibly another friend group. Because they're feeling, depressed and sad. I think
decline in school performance.
Yeah, school performance. We look at the function in all three areas. Social, so if they're starting to decline socially with their peers, family, if they're starting to isolate, arguments, irritable, not engaging like they used to, not enjoying things they used to do. And then with school performance, a lot of it is school refusal or struggling in school. A lot of times grades will tank, sometimes it's gradual, but just noticing those three different areas of like, how are they functioning? And when they start to lose function in those three areas, then that's scary. that's cause for concern.
That makes total sense.
Oh, good.
Do you have anything to add?
No, I was just going to say, along those lines, I think just the ones that we see most is, change in appetite.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. I have that written down too.
I think also.
Can you say more about that?
Oh, just if they just stop eating, and they're just restricting their diet, and maybe even overeating.
Yeah, it can go both ways.
Yeah. So I think those kind of things. But I agree with what Allison said. It's about the biggest part is the social, and then if they're having, if they have a prized possession and they give it away, that's another sign and symptom. And the other thing is, if they just feel like they've lost all of their
hope,
ability, and their hope.
Okay.
And let's say a kid who's in prestige, maybe they've lost prestige at school. Maybe they've fallen from grace in somehow, and they're talked about or they're bullied or whatever.
Bullying.
One of the biggest things that I see is school failure. Like just not feeling like they belong, and that academic trauma kind of thing, where our society is so built on not failing, and it's failure is taboo,
or perfection. Needing to be perfect.
And so when they're not achieving those things, then we start seeing a lot of hopelessness and a lot of helplessness, and that's when I really want to check out, and we really have to pay attention to those things.
And the trauma, right? Traumatic events that happen, loss of a parent, divorce of a parent,
loss of a friend,
loss of a friend, breakups. And a lot of parents, their teen might come to them and say, I broke up with my boyfriend, and the parent's like, well, you were dating for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
But they don't understand the reality of a teen's world, right?
Or they've forgotten.
Yeah, or they've
we
forgotten.
were all there at one point where our world was ending.
Yeah.
When this one boy didn't like us, or a girl, or whoever,
Right. Yeah. And they're like, you'll get over it. You'll find someone else. Well, to that teen, that's so invalidating. Yeah. And then, all of, especially like, there's a lot of, being on the outs at school. There's a lot of, especially with older adolescents, breakups are end of the world, and we've got to validate that and take it seriously instead of just throwing
Juliet's popular for a reason, right? I mean, it's a classic. It was two teens in love who couldn't be together, and it ended sadly in suicide. Right. So it's a real thing. We can't downplay it with our teens. Their emotions are big, and while they may not seem like it's that important to us, it is to them.
100%.
Yes.
And I think then when it helps the teens, when we validate that, you may have dated a person for a week and you broke up and it's causing all this distress and these thoughts. It's like when we validate that, then they're more willing to come and talk about it, what's going on, because a lot of teenagers are so closed off and parents really don't know what's going on with them. So,
and I think the obvious one I just want to point out before we move on is talk about and preoccupation with death. Can also be a major red flag.
That's so interesting, because my favorite question to ask students is, what do you think happens when you die?
Oh, yeah.
Like, so you're suicidal, like what do you think is going to happen? And a lot of times they don't know. They're like, gosh, I don't know. Maybe I'll be with all my friends, and so really kind of exploring that too, because that kind of gives me information as a clinician of like what they're wanting, what they're, I'll be, have all these friends, and I'll have a perfect boyfriend, and my parents will be back together, and we'll be all in heaven, so then that kind of conceptualize, well, okay. And a lot of times they say, gosh, I don't know. I just want the pain to end. Yeah. And I had one clinician say to me that, like, that was struggling with suicide, said that her therapist said, well, what if your mental health issues come with you? Yeah. Then what? So it's just interesting. And I can't wait to dive more into these kind of conversations that you have when we're trying to evaluate, like, because I've even asked, and this is jumping ahead, but
do you really want to die, or do you just want to be out of pain, right? So
what I like to add is like, what's going to happen. Have you thought about how that might affect, your best friend, or even
Animals.
and your pet, or your
Because sometimes it could be revenge to get, oh, I want to hurt my school. They're all bullying me. They're gonna get theirs and know what they did to me, right?
Big question that I think our listeners and I have is, how can parents differentiate between normal teenage mood swings, which can look really dramatic and end of the world, and like you said, I just broke up with my boyfriend I met 2 days ago or 2 weeks ago and the world's ending, versus something more serious?
Yeah. Well, how I would answer that question is, first of all, giving parents that deference of them knowing their child. You know your child better than anyone else, and what's normal for them and what's not. And so what I would say is what's a normal kind of reaction from teens is those things that we all have gone through, right? Like they don't. Parental connection is minimized. Their friends are more important than sometimes even their entire family. But also recognizing that even if they're not having any friend connections, if they're not doing anything, if they're isolating more, and you're not seeing them hang out, I would say that's concerning. Because we all have to have connection in some way.
But what if you have like a kid who is an introvert and they just rather read a book in their room than go outside and play?
And if that's their norm,
okay,
then I would say that's least of my worries if they've always done that. But I would also say, okay, what are they reading? Are they reading things about death? Are they reading things about just about like superheroes?
Or are they on YouTube going down a rabbit hole there, which could be really scary?
If they're on YouTube going down that rabbit hole. So if they are introvert, what are they reading? What's their content?
What's their social media?
Yeah, because somebody who's into watching Marvel movies, that's different than somebody who's now watching Faces of Death and
13 Reasons Why or whatever that.
Yeah,
well, and it's important for our listeners to realize, parents who aren't as familiar, but there's echo chambers, especially in social media, that if they're gonna look up something about death or suicide, they're going to their algorithm's going to feed them more and more and more information of that. Right. So it's good to know what your kids are being exposed to.
Absolutely. Yeah. And also, what are they, if they're writing, things about death or journaling and those kind of things, those can be concerning. Now, teenagers by nature are a different animal. And
very dramatic.
We've all went through it. And so I think it also goes back to what have we done to normalize their ability to connect with us. And if that's disrupted in any way, and they're being angry and they're acting out and they're doing things that are not normal for them, I would say that's when we need to be concerned. Arguing and not picking up their room and those kind of things.
Not doing their hygiene. Hygiene's a big one. When they stop doing self-care, that's a big red flag.
Can we just say too, it is normal for teenage brains specifically to take high risks. Like they are risk seekers, so they keep that in mind, because that's hard to differentiate of is this a normal risk take, or are they doing something that's out of the norm that's a little scarier?
It just goes back to knowing your teen.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And if it's what's typical and what's not, as I said, it's not just it's the level of functioning that starts to decrease in all the different areas, right? Versus someone that's doing really well, someone is, they haven't decreased in their level of functioning in any of the areas I talked about. And they may say, oh, I'm feeling suicidal, or I don't want to be here. And it's really, too, the terminology that they use that we'll go into in later episodes that helps me understand what maybe will be typical mood swings or like distress, and then how to get them to get out of that mindset of saying those things, because those things are so scary, and how to articulate what they're really feeling.
Yeah, there's like a popular phrase amongst teens that is "go kill yourself," and they have an acronym for it that they text.
Yeah.
Have you seen that?
Yes.
No, that's horrible.
GKY, I think is. So parents, if you're listening, if your kids are texting GKY, you should be concerned because it's like this kind of like, oh, shut up, or you're stupid. But they say it, and I'm like, I've talked to my kids where I'm like, you can't, this isn't even funny to say. I don't care if all the kids are saying it. Like, so anyways, that was just something I want to point out to our listeners, that kids have these little phrases that they think are not a big deal to go tell a kid. But if a kid is suicidal and depressed, and your teen's the one texting them, not realizing the impact it's going to have, that could be really detrimental. But I love what you said about knowing your teen, because there's times where my kids, where I'm like, I go through in my mind when they're having an off day. I'm like, okay, I try to evaluate. Like, I'm like, are my daughters on their period? Have they eaten? Have they been sick? Oh, they just started middle school. They're really anxious. They have a big project. Like, I go through the like, are their necessities being met? Have they eaten? Like, I go through, has their body been taken care of? Like, oh, okay, they haven't eaten for 4 hours. Oh, all you had was Jolly Ranchers for breakfast, or Fruity Pebbles. Okay, let's start there. And if that doesn't fix it, then I'm like, okay, there's something more going on. It's just trying to figure out like what's knowing my
normal
teen.
development and what's not. And I think that again, like I said, it's about knowing your teen, but also it's about just being observant of those little things. And maybe, one day you're like, oh my gosh, this is not them. And then the next day it's not there. It like you said, it's just a bad day, right? It's a one-off. So what I think is really the one of the biggest things that a parent can do is just look at the patterns of behavior. And is this something that's just happened just one day, or is this something that has happened not only today, but we're seeing it day after day after day, and it's starting to cause problems in other areas of their lives.
Correct.
And so, Allison mentioned hygiene, for example. Not taking a shower for a day is no big deal. But hey, you haven't showered for a week. What is going on with you? And so,
or you haven't changed your clothes, even in at OASIS, like that's. So I'm always looking at the students and seeing what they're wearing and looking at their hygiene, because that's the first red flag to me. If I have a student that's dressing up every day, putting makeup on, and for 4 or 5 days in a row, they're in their pajamas, in the same clothes.
We want to know why. Yeah.
We want to know why. That's and so it's these little things parents can pick up on. As I mentioned previously, some of the completed suicides, the parents said they had no idea that their student was struggling, but really talking and diving into it, it's like, oh yeah, they did quit the football team. He did, stop caring about school. He did stop caring about the way he looked. And so when you dive into it and really start talking to the parents, it's like the signs were there, but the parents were not, I guess,
as attentive
and
aware?
as aware or involved in the function of why these things were occurring.
That's actually was my next question. Is it possible for someone to exhibit no warning signs? And it sounds like you answered that in regards to that. Well, it's maybe they had warning signs, but it's more possible that you missed it. Maybe you're preoccupied with another kid or something else, or your own mental health, and right? So it sounds like,
or they assure you that they're fine,
or they're really good at masking.
Yep.
Well, so that's a great question. Like, is it possible that they exhibit no symptoms? Absolutely, it's possible. And but I think there's a distinction between not exhibiting any signs, which would be maybe someone who has said, you know what, I'm not saying a word.
Because I'm serious.
Because I'm very serious about this.
And I don't want anyone to disrupt my plan.
Yeah. And then there's those who, who maybe are impulsive and they just, having a bad day or a bad week or whatever. So, I think we have to we have to understand that there are people sometimes that they don't want to say anything. They're very serious and they go out and they're successful.
And there's not a whole lot people around them can do about it, right?
Parents out there, you need to understand that we can be the best parents in the world and still have a child who suffers internally, externally. That doesn't mean that we necessarily missed anything.
Or that you failed as a
Correct.
parent.
Or that you failed.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. I think that's so important for our listeners to realize is that this is not a reflection of whether or not you were a good enough parent,
right,
or if you failed. There are things, as we were talking about as therapists, that if we've worked in this field long enough, we're going to come across someone who's going to be successful at it, unfortunately, no matter how good of a therapist we are, and how involved we are. And it's the same with parents and family members and friends who are affected by this, that if someone has really made up their mind and kept their cards close to their chest, agency is a real thing.
Yep.
And people have the right to their agency. And so it's important to, we'll jump ahead, but make sure that you're not blaming yourself, right? And getting your own therapy.
And I had a very wise supervisor, tell me once that, they could go to the best hospitals in the country and have the best therapists and have the best team of support around them. And just like cancer, you could, your child could still complete. It is possible. So.
Yeah. I think that's important to point out.
Yeah. But we want to move on to hope too.
Yes. Okay. So I want to ask you a last question. How can parents approach these conversations with their teens without causing more distress?
Yeah. That is a great question. I think I look at that and what's okay to say and what's not okay to say. I think what's not okay to say is you'll just get over it.
Or why are you depressed? You have everything you need. You have a house. You have friends. That's very
so
invalidating.
Yes.
Or there are children in Africa starving,
who have it worse than you do.
Yeah.
Right. And so we don't want to invalidate. That's for sure. And then I think the questions to ask, sometimes going back to those hard questions, is, tell me how you're feeling. Do you feel like you still want to be here? Have you thought about taking your own life? That's a hard question, but we need to ask it. And that can be at the end of our discussion with our kids, and then also sharing some personal experiences that you've gone through as when you were their age, and normalizing that. We want to get these kids to open up. And so asking those hard questions like, what's going on? Tell me what would make a person your age feel this way. Giving them permission to kind of start diving into some of those deeper things that they haven't told people before. But I think that along those lines, we need to ask those hard questions about, have you thought about, taking your life? Have you thought about leaving this earth? It sounds harsh, but if you have a teen who is thinking about those things, sometimes you have to go there.
Well, and we're going to dive more into that this next episode, so stay tuned, listeners. I think I love what you said is showing up. I think the best we can do is, parents, you don't have to know what to say.
Right.
You could even say, I don't know what to say to you other than I love you and I'm here for you.
Right.
If that's all you can stumble out in that moment of just holding space for them and validating them and saying, I don't have the answers and I don't know exactly what to say.
I can't imagine how hard it is to feel this way.
Yeah.
I love you anyways.
And I love
no matter
you,
what.
and I'm committed to being here for you and being present for you and helping you. What do you need?
Yeah.
What can I do to support you right now? And a lot of times they may not know, and it's okay if they don't know. And you can say, well, let's figure it out together. Let's figure it out what you need. What is, causing all this distress? Because I think, again, if you go back to the function and really understanding like the dynamics that's causing this much distress, because they are in so much distress, and then treating that and helping them with that is the key too. And having that relationship so your child feels comfortable enough to share some of the things going on.
And again, listeners, remember that it's not an easy answer. It's not black and white. We could probably do a 3-hour episode on this and dive even more of like what leads up to this. And it's not just one thing.
No.
It's so many things. But I do want to end on, you talked about connection with the parent at the end. Both of you have, we all have at one point, but let's talk about the protective factors. What can parents look out for if their kid is feeling suicidal or showing these signs that we talked about and it feels really scary? Again, the number one top thing is connectedness.
Right.
Individual, family, and community.
Right.
Are they connected? Effective mental health care, contact with the primary support system.
Right.
Restricted access to lethal means. If you are a gun owner, that's great that we have that right, but please make sure it's locked up.
Yeah.
Especially if you have a kid who's exhibiting any of these warning signs.
Yes.
100%.
Yes.
And unfortunately, I have seen impulsive teenagers get into safes. They know your code. They know how to get your gun.
Or your medication.
Or your medication. You think it's locked up in safe. I guarantee your child knows that code.
To take extra precautions with that. And then supportive relationship with healthcare providers. Do they have coping and problem solving skills?
Right.
Yeah.
And then a huge one is cultural and religious beliefs around this topic can also be a protective factor.
And animals.
Oh, animals! Thank you.
Animals. That's the first thing I talk about when a student of mine comes to me and says they're suicidal. I'm like, what would your dog do without you? And so reminding them of those, that they're animals and their life worth living goals. I had a student that had chronic suicidal thoughts, and when she'd get feeling that way, her dream was to go to University of San Diego. So we'd go and we'd pull the website up and we'd take the virtual tour and reminding, that this is just this thought, these feelings are temporary.
Yeah.
We've just got to
pass.
ride this wave. They're going to pass. How do we get them to pass? And so that's another thing too. So knowing what the goals are of your child, knowing what their life worth living goals are.
Yeah, their dreams.
Their dreams, their aspirations, everything. And then, reinforcing that. And especially building that toolbox, helping them build that toolbox of what helps in those moments when they are feeling suicidal. Because they can have the thoughts and not act on them.
Yeah.
Both can be true.
Yeah. And I like to really point out to my clients I work with is you are not your thoughts. They're not reality. Just
Feelings are not
think
facts.
them and feel them doesn't make it facts.
Yeah.
And they can be changed. Yep.
They come and go.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you guys so much for joining us on this episode. I look forward to talking to you guys more. Listeners, stay tuned. We're going to be talking about life-saving toolkits for our parents, giving you actual tools and resources and skills you can use if you do find yourself in this situation. So stay tuned. And again, thank you so much, Allison and Reggie, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.